The morning of May 28, 1918, dawned with a deceptive quietness over the French village of Cantigny, where young American soldiers of the 1st Division crouched in muddy trenches, their hands trembling, not from cold, but from the terrible knowledge that they were about to face something none of their training had prepared them for the full, crushing weight of industrial warfare on European soil. These farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Pennsylvania, and college students from Massachusetts had crossed an ocean believing they understood war, but the veteran French poilus who watched them from adjacent positions knew better. They recognized in these fresh-faced doughboys the same dangerous innocence they themselves had carried into battle 4 years earlier, before the Western Front had transformed them into hollow-eyed survivors of humanity's most mechanized slaughter. The American Expeditionary Forces, commanded by General John Joseph Pershing, had arrived in France throughout 1917 with bands playing and flags waving, promising to break the deadlock that had consumed millions of lives since 1914. President Thomas Woodrow Wilson had declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917, proclaiming a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. And the nation had responded with patriotic fervor that seemed to belong to an earlier, simpler century. Recruitment offices overflowed with volunteers eager to prove American manhood against the battle-hardened Germans, while those who hesitated found themselves shamed by propaganda posters and pressured by conscription laws that would eventually mobilize nearly 5 million men. But enthusiasm could not substitute for experience, and the American military of 1917 was woefully unprepared for modern combat. The regular army numbered barely 130,000 men, most of whom had fought only colonial insurgencies in the Philippines or chased Pancho Villa through Mexican deserts. They carried Springfield rifles that functioned well enough but knew nothing of creeping barrages, gas attacks, or the intricate trench systems that had evolved into underground cities along the Western Front. The National Guard units were little better, composed mainly of weekend warriors who drilled in armories and dreamed of glory without comprehending the industrial-scale death that awaited them. According to military historian Edward M. Kaufman's detailed account in The War to End All Wars, the American soldiers who disembarked at French ports throughout late 1917 and early 1918 were supremely confident and supremely ignorant of what modern warfare entailed. They treated the journey as an adventure, singing popular songs like Over There and believing they would wrap up the war within months. The French and British troops who encountered them felt a mixture of gratitude for the reinforcements and pity for their naivety. British General Douglas Haig privately expressed doubts about American combat effectiveness, while French Marshal Philippe Pétain worried that untested troops might break under pressure, potentially causing a catastrophic gap in the Allied lines. The German High Command watched American arrivals with calculating concern. General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's de facto military dictator, understood that time was running out for the Central Powers. Russia had collapsed into revolution, freeing German divisions for transfer westward. But America's industrial might and manpower reserves threatened to tip the balance permanently against Germany, if given sufficient time to mobilize. Ludendorff planned a series of massive spring offensives designed to smash through Allied lines before American strength could make itself felt, gambling everything on victory before the doughboys learned how to fight. The village of Cantigny represented more than a military objective when American commanders selected it for their first independent offensive operation. It symbolized a test of national honor and military capability that would determine whether the United States could stand as an equal among the world's martial powers or would require permanent subordination to French and British command. Throughout early 1918, Allied commanders had insisted on amalgamating American units into their own depleted divisions, treating the doughboys as mere replacement fodder rather than a cohesive national army. General Pershing had resisted furiously, understanding that American public opinion demanded their soldiers fight under their own flag, but his position grew increasingly difficult as German offensives in March and April drove deep salients into Allied lines, creating desperate situations that seemed to require immediate American intervention, regardless of unit integrity. The 1st Division, nicknamed the Big Red One for the distinctive shoulder patch its soldiers wore, had been selected for this crucial operation precisely because it represented the best-trained American forces available, commanded by Major General Robert Lee Bullard, a career officer from Alabama who had fought Native Americans in the West and insurgents in the Philippines. The division had spent months in relatively quiet sectors learning trench warfare fundamentals from French instructors. But instruction differed vastly from execution, and everyone understood that Cantigny would reveal whether American soldiers possessed the discipline and courage necessary for offensive operations against the formidable German army. Captain George C. Marshall, a staff officer who would later achieve fame in the Second World War, spent the weeks before the attack coordinating the intricate details that modern offensive operations required. Artillery had to be registered on German positions, ammunition stockpiled, assault waves organized, communication lines established, and medical facilities prepared for anticipated casualties. The 28th Infantry Regiment, which would lead the assault, rehearsed endlessly on terrain similar to their objective, practicing with live ammunition to accustom men to advancing under fire. French observers noted approvingly that the Americans displayed enthusiasm and adaptability, though they worried privately whether these qualities would survive contact with German machine guns and artillery. The German defenders occupying Cantigny belonged to the 18th Army, veterans who had recently participated in Ludendorff's spring offensives and possessed intimate knowledge of defensive tactics. They had transformed the village into a fortress, with concrete machine gun bunkers covering every approach, deep dugouts providing shelter from artillery bombardment, and barbed wire entanglements, channeling attackers into predetermined killing zones. German doctrine emphasized counterattacks to reclaim any lost ground, meaning that capturing Cantigny would prove easier than holding it against inevitable attempts to drive the Americans out. At 5:45 in the morning on May 28th, American artillery began its preparatory bombardment, hurling thousands of shells onto German positions in a thunderous demonstration of firepower that marked America's announcement of its arrival as a combatant power. The soldiers of the 28th Infantry, crouched in their jumping-off trenches, felt the ground shake beneath them as high explosive rounds pulverized buildings and shrapnel shells scythed through barbed wire. Tanks French-built, Schneider models manned by French crews rumbled forward to support the infantry assault, their steel hulls offering psychological comfort, even though their mechanical unreliability meant most would break down before reaching the objective. At 6:45, whistles blew along the American line and officers shouted over the top. In conscious imitation of British terminology, the doughboys scrambled up trench ladders and began advancing across no man's land in waves, maintaining the formation discipline that training had drilled into them despite every instinct screaming to run or take cover. German machine guns immediately opened fire, their distinctive rattling sound cutting through the morning air as bullets kicked up dirt around the advancing Americans. Men fell, some killed instantly, others wounded and crying for medics, but the assault waves continued forward with a determination that surprised even themselves. Within an hour, American soldiers had overrun the German frontline positions and were fighting through Cantigny's ruins, clearing cellars and dugouts with rifles, grenades, and bayonets in vicious close-quarters combat. The capture of Cantigny had taken less than 2 hours, but holding the shattered village against German counterattacks would test American resolve far more severely than the initial assault, revealing that modern warfare measured success not in ground gained, but in ground retained, against an enemy determined to reclaim every inch at any cost. By mid-morning on May 28th, the 28th Infantry Regiment had consolidated its positions along the village's eastern edge, establishing defensive positions in shell-blasted buildings and freshly dug trenches while casualties from the assault were evacuated rearward through communication trenches that zigzagged back toward American lines. The first German counterattack materialized shortly after noon, preceded by an artillery bombardment that exceeded in intensity anything the Americans had yet experienced.
Yes.
German batteries, including heavy guns, firing shells weighing hundreds of pounds, systematically demolished what remained of Cantigny's structures, transforming the village into a moonscape of craters and rubble. The psychological impact of this bombardment proved almost as devastating as its physical effects. Soldiers who had felt victorious just hours earlier now cowered in whatever cover they could find, some crying, others praying, all discovering that courage was not an inexhaustible resource but something that had to be constantly renewed against circumstances designed to extinguish it. Lieutenant Colonel Hanson E. Illy, commanding the 28th Infantry's 2nd Battalion, moved through the bombardment, checking his men's positions and projecting a calmness he did not feel. A West Point graduate who understood that leadership under fire required personal example, Illy exposed himself repeatedly to danger, reasoning that soldiers who saw their commander refusing to take cover would find their own courage reinforced. His gamble worked. Men who might otherwise have broken instead held their positions, drawing strength from his presence even as shells exploded around them. When the German infantry assault finally came, advancing in disciplined lines supported by their own machine gun teams, the Americans met them with rifle fire, machine gun bursts, and artillery support from batteries positioned behind the lines. The fighting devolved into a series of desperate small unit actions as German assault troops infiltrated American positions, forcing hand-to-hand combat in trenches and around strongpoints. Private Marcellus H. Childs from Tennessee found himself isolated with 3 other soldiers in a shell crater, surrounded by advancing Germans who called for their surrender in accented English. Instead of capitulating, Childs and his companions fought back with rifles and grenades, holding their position until relieving forces could reach them in action that would later earn Childs a Distinguished Service Cross. The first counterattack was repulsed by early afternoon, but German commanders immediately organized another and then another, maintaining pressure throughout the day as they attempted to demonstrate that the American success had been a fluke rather than a genuine military achievement. Each assault followed the same pattern: intense artillery preparation, infantry advance in small groups using cover and concealment, attempts to infiltrate rather than frontally assault strong positions. The Americans learned quickly, adapting their defensive tactics with each successive attack, but casualties mounted steadily. Company commanders who had led over 200 men into the assault found themselves commanding barely 100 by evening, with many of the losses coming not from German fire, but from their own artillery, which sometimes fell short, and from the simple, physical, and psychological exhaustion that combat induced. Compounding American difficulties was a supply problem that nearly proved fatal. The communication trenches connecting Cantigny to rear areas came under persistent German artillery fire, making movement forward or backward extraordinarily dangerous. Ammunition, water, medical supplies, and reinforcements had to be carried forward by exposed runners, who often became casualties themselves. Wounded men waited hours for evacuation, lying in shell holes or trenches while their injuries worsened, and their morale, that of their unwounded comrades who saw them suffering, deteriorated. Medical personnel performed miracles of improvisation, treating casualties under fire with inadequate supplies, but they could not compensate for the systemic logistics failures that modern offensive operations revealed in the American military system. The sun rose on May 29th over a Cantigny transformed into hell's own landscape. Exhausted American soldiers who had not slept in over 30 hours maintained their positions through sheer, stubborn determination. Having crossed some psychological threshold where survival demanded the suppression of all thoughts beyond the immediate present, the German counterattacks continued with methodical persistence, each one carefully prepared and executed by troops who refused to accept that Americans could hold ground against the vaunted German army. Yet each assault broke against defensive positions that grew stronger as soldiers learned from experience what training could never teach. Sergeant Samuel Woodfill, a regular Army veteran from Indiana, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for actions at another engagement, exemplified the kind of soldier who made the difference between success and failure during those desperate hours. Woodfill moved along the American line, identifying weak points, redistributing ammunition, encouraging exhausted men, and personally engaging German positions with his rifle. During one counterattack, he single-handedly eliminated 3 German machine gun nests, using grenades and his rifle to kill or capture their crews, then consolidated those positions into the American defensive system. His actions, multiplied across dozens of sergeants and corporals who exercised initiative and leadership at the tactical level, demonstrated that American soldiers could match German professionalism when properly led and motivated. The battle also revealed the critical importance of combined arms coordination, the integration of infantry, artillery, machine guns, and other supporting elements into a cohesive system that multiplied combat effectiveness beyond what any single arm could achieve. American artillery forward observers, positioned dangerously close to frontline positions, called fire missions onto German assembly areas, and advancing troops with increasing accuracy as they gained experience. Counter-battery fire artillery specifically targeting enemy guns reduced the intensity of German bombardments, while carefully planned defensive barrages broke up German assault formations before they could close with American positions. According to historian Alan R. Millett's comprehensive study, the General Robert L. Bullard, an officership in the United States Army, The Cantigny operation demonstrated that American military institutions could rapidly assimilate combat lessons when given the opportunity. Officers who had commanded according to textbook principles on May 28th were improvising tactical innovations by May 30th, while enlisted men who had been raw recruits months earlier were functioning as combat veterans. The American capacity for pragmatic adaptation, for discarding what did not work and embracing what did, regardless of doctrine or tradition, would prove to be one of the nation's greatest military assets. By May 30th, the German High Command recognized that further counterattacks against Cantigny would waste resources needed elsewhere. Ludendorff's spring offensives had created deep salients into Allied lines, but these advances had not achieved the decisive breakthrough that German strategy required. The Americans holding Cantigny represented a strategic problem. If untested troops could successfully conduct offensive operations and hold captured ground, then the massive American army being mobilized would eventually overwhelm Germany through sheer numerical superiority. Ludendorff needed victories against the French and British before American strength became irresistible, which meant he could not afford to fixate on a single village, regardless of its symbolic importance. The fighting around Cantigny gradually subsided into the routine violence of trench warfare sniping. Patrol actions, sporadic artillery exchanges, as both sides acknowledged an effective stalemate. American casualties for the three-day battle totaled approximately 1,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, a modest figure by Western Front standards, but shocking to a nation unaccustomed to such losses. The 1st Division had proven it could fight, but it had also learned that modern warfare consumed men and material at rates that previous American military experience had never approached. Each yard of ground at Cantigny had cost blood, and Cantigny represented merely one small village on a front stretching hundreds of miles. While the 1st Division consolidated its victory at Cantigny, a far more desperate situation was developing 60 miles to the southeast, where German forces spearheading Ludendorff's third major offensive had smashed through French defenses and were driving toward the Marne River with Paris itself as their ultimate objective, threatening to achieve the breakthrough that had eluded them since 1914. The 2nd and 3rd American divisions rushed forward in trucks and on foot to plug gaps in the crumbling Allied line, found themselves thrown into combat with minimal preparation, facing battle-hardened German assault divisions that had repeatedly demonstrated their capacity to break enemy formations and exploit success with devastating speed. The American 2nd Division reached the vicinity of Château-Thierry on June 1, 1918, and immediately moved into positions defending the Paris-Metz highway, a critical transportation route whose loss would facilitate German penetration toward the French capital. The division consisted of both regular Army and Marine Corps brigades, the latter comprising the 4th and 5th Marine Regiments, whose members insisted loudly and to the irritation of Army personnel that Marines represented America's premier fighting force. This inter-service rivalry, while petty in retrospect, created a competitive spirit that would manifest in extraordinary combat performance as each service sought to outdo the other. French forces retreating through American positions told demoralizing stories of German invincibility, of assault troops who fought with machine-like precision and seemed impervious to casualties. French officers advised the Americans to prepare defensive positions further rearward, implicitly suggesting that holding the current line was impossible. Captain Lloyd W. Williams of the 5th Marines supposedly responded to one such suggestion with the famous retort, "Retreat. Hell, we just got here," though historians debate whether those exact words were actually spoken. Regardless of precise phrasing, the sentiment captured American determination to hold ground regardless of circumstances, a determination that appeared almost naive to Allied veterans who had learned through bitter experience when positions were untenable. The German advance reached American positions on June 2nd, initiating a series of battles around Belleau Wood and associated villages that would rage throughout the month and achieve iconic status in American military history. Belleau Wood itself was an unremarkable hunting preserve of about 1 square mile, filled with trees, underbrush, and rocky outcroppings that created ideal defensive terrain for German machine gunners who fortified positions throughout the forest. The Marines assigned to clear the wood faced a tactical nightmare, advancing through vegetation that limited visibility against defenders who could see them coming, over terrain that provided minimal cover. On June 6th, The Marine Brigade launched its assault on Belleau Wood with an elan that recalled Napoleonic warfare more than modern combat. Marines advanced across open wheat fields in waves, maintaining linear formations that presented magnificent targets for German machine guns positioned along the wood's edge. The result was predictable and horrific. Marines fell by the dozens, cut down by interlocking machine gun fire that swept the fields with methodical precision. Companies that began the day with 200 men finished with 50. Yet the Marines continued advancing, displaying a ferocity that stunned both the Germans, who opposed them, and the French, who witnessed the assault. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Daly, a two-time Medal of Honor recipient from earlier campaigns, allegedly shouted, "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" As he led his men forward, another quotation that may be apocryphal, but captured the spirit with which Marines approached their impossible mission. The mixture of profane irreverence and fatalistic courage represented a distinctly American approach to combat, one that relied less on tactical sophistication than on raw aggression and the willingness to absorb casualties that more cautious forces would consider prohibitive. The Marine assault on Belleau would devolve into 3 weeks of the most savage close-quarters fighting the American military had yet experienced, transforming the small forest into a charnel house where men fought from tree to tree with rifles, grenades, bayonets, and sometimes bare hands in combat that reduced warfare to its most primitive essence. Unlike the relatively open terrain at Cantigny, Belleau Wood's dense vegetation negated most technological advantages, forcing soldiers to engage enemies at ranges where they could see facial expressions, where combat became intensely personal rather than the abstract exchange of fire at distance that characterized most Western Front engagements. German defenders, primarily from the 5th Guard Division and the 28th Division, had prepared Belleau Wood with their characteristic thoroughness, positioning machine gun nests to cover every approach and establishing defensive positions among rocky outcroppings that provided natural fortifications. These were not second-line troops, but elite formations that had spearheaded successful offensives throughout the spring. Confident in their superiority and determined to teach the Americans the harsh realities of modern combat, German officers expressed contempt for Marine tactics, viewing their frontal assaults as reckless and wasteful. Yet they also recognized that American soldiers possessed a disturbing willingness to continue attacking, despite losses that would have forced less determined troops to withdraw. The Marines adapted gradually to forest fighting, abandoning their initial linear tactics in favor of small unit infiltration techniques that the Germans themselves had pioneered. Squads learned to maneuver independently, using covering fire to suppress enemy positions while others advanced, employing grenades to clear machine gun nests and dugouts. The fighting became a series of countless small actions rather than one coherent battle, with sergeants and corporals exercising tactical authority as they led their men through terrain where officers could not maintain overall control. Private Carl Brannan, a Marine from Mississippi, whose memoir Over There provides one of the most honest accounts of Belleau Wood fighting, described the experience as one of constant fear punctuated by moments of terror, where the psychological strain of never knowing when death might arrive proved as exhausting as the physical demands of combat. Brannan watched friends killed beside him, saw wounded men crying for help in no man's land, where reaching them meant probable death, witnessed all the horror that industrial warfare generated, yet continued functioning because military discipline and unit cohesion provided structure that prevented psychological collapse. Medical personnel struggled to evacuate wounded from Belleau Wood's interior. As German machine gun fire swept any movement and artillery bombardments cratered paths through the forest, 8 corpsmen often had to wait until darkness to reach casualties, by which time some had bled to death from wounds that proper immediate treatment might have survived. The experience of the wounded lying helpless under fire, hoping someone would eventually reach them, created a terror that combat itself did not always generate, and many soldiers feared being wounded more than being killed, because wounds meant prolonged suffering, while death promised immediate release. By mid-June, the Marines had secured portions of Belleau Wood, but German forces still held critical positions from which they launched counterattacks designed to reclaim lost ground. The battle assumed the character of the larger Western Front stalemate, with both sides occupying fortified positions, neither able to decisively defeat the other, casualties mounting for minimal territorial gains. American commanders fed reinforcements into the meat grinder, determined to achieve victory regardless of cost, partly because failure would validate Allied doubts about American combat capability, and partly because institutional pride demanded that Marines, having claimed they could clear the wood, could not admit defeat. The fighting finally concluded on June 26th, when American forces secured the last German positions in Belleau Wood, after nearly 3 weeks of continuous combat. The Marines had suffered over 1,800 killed and 7,500 wounded, casualties approaching 50% of engaged strength for a forest whose strategic significance hardly justified such losses. But strategy was not the point. Belleau Wood had become a test of will, a demonstration that Americans could match German soldiers in determination, even if they could not yet match them in tactical sophistication. The successful defense of the Marne River sector and the capture of Belleau Wood, achieved at such terrible cost, positioned American forces to participate in the Allied counteroffensive that would fundamentally alter the war's trajectory, shifting the initiative from German to Allied forces and beginning the process that would culminate in Germany's defeat 4 months later. The Second Battle of the Marne, which began on July 15, 1918, represented Ludendorff's final attempt to achieve decisive victory through offensive action. When this effort failed and Allied forces, including substantial American contingents, launched their own offensive on July 18th, the strategic balance on the Western Front changed irrevocably. 8 American divisions participated in the A&M-Marne offensive that began on July 18th, representing the largest commitment of United States forces to date and demonstrating that America had finally mobilized sufficient strength to influence the war's outcome. These divisions included both regular Army and National Guard formations, the latter having finally received enough training to be considered combat-ready, though their actual effectiveness would only be proven through battle. The 1st and 2nd Divisions, veterans of Cantigny and Belleau Wood, spearheaded the assault alongside French-Moroccan colonial troops, attacking from the western face of the Marne salient that German offensives had created. The Aisne-Marne offensive employed tactics that differed significantly from earlier operations, emphasizing speed and depth rather than methodical advances from trench line to trench line. Allied commanders had studied German offensive methods from the spring campaigns, recognizing that breakthrough required exploiting success rapidly before defenders could establish new positions. Light artillery accompanied assault troops, providing immediate fire support, while reserves stood ready to reinforce success, rather than being committed according to predetermined schedules. The French provided hundreds of Renault light tanks, small two-man vehicles that, despite mechanical unreliability, offered mobile firepower that infantry could not match. The 1st Division attacked near Soissons on July 18th, advancing through pre-dawn darkness without the customary preparatory bombardment in order to achieve surprise. The assault succeeded brilliantly. German defenders, expecting only routine patrol activity, found themselves overrun before they could organize effective resistance. American infantry, supported by French tanks, penetrated several miles into German positions, capturing artillery batteries, supply dumps, and hundreds of prisoners. The success vindicated the aggressive tactics that American commanders favored, though it also revealed continuing problems with logistics, communication, and coordination that would require additional experience to resolve. Private Thomas F. Casey of Pennsylvania experienced the Aisne-Marne offensive as a chaotic blur of movement, combat, exhaustion, and occasional terror that bore little resemblance to the static trench warfare for which his training had prepared him. His company advanced continuously for days, pausing only briefly to rest, resupply, and integrate replacements for casualties. They crossed terrain liberated from German occupation, passing through villages destroyed by 4 years of warfare, encountering French civilians emerging from cellars where they had sheltered during the fighting, seeing the material detritus of German retreat-abandoned equipment, dead horses, discarded supplies. The advance generated exhilaration mixed with exhaustion. Soldiers felt they were finally winning rather than merely surviving, yet the physical and psychological demands of sustained offensive operations proved as taxing as defensive combat. German forces conducted a fighting retreat, establishing successive defensive positions and counterattacking whenever Americans appeared vulnerable. The advance that had begun with such dramatic success gradually slowed as German resistance stiffened, and American supply lines lengthened, creating the familiar pattern of diminishing returns that characterize Western Front offensives. By early August, the Aisne-Marne offensive had pushed German forces back to positions they had held before their spring offensives, eliminating the Marne salient and restoring the front to a straighter configuration. but it had not achieved breakthrough that operational planning had envisioned. American casualties during the ANRN offensive exceeded 50,000 men killed and wounded, numbers that shocked the American public when newspapers reported them, and that prompted difficult questions about whether victory justified such costs. The offensive had demonstrated that American forces could conduct mobile operations successfully, but it had also revealed that modern warfare consumed manpower at rates that even America's large population could not sustain indefinitely. The romantic notions with which soldiers had begun the war images of decisive battles and heroic charges had given way to grimmer understanding that victory required grinding attrition, where success was measured in yards gained and casualties inflicted, rather than glorious climactic engagements. By September 1918, the American Expeditionary Forces had grown to over 1 million combat troops, organized into multiple corps and army-level formations. Finally achieving the independent command structure that General Pershing had demanded since 1917, American forces prepared to conduct their first operation as a distinct national army rather than as individual divisions attached to French or British command. The target selected for this demonstration of American military capability was the Saint-Mihiel salient, a triangular bulge in Allied lines south of Verdun that German forces had held since 1914, and that represented both a strategic liability for the Germans and a symbolic objective whose capture would prove American operational competence. Planning for the Saint-Mihiel offensive involved unprecedented coordination between American, French, and British forces, with Allied partners providing artillery, tanks, and air support that American formations still lacked. Colonel George S. Patton, Jr., commanding American tank forces and destined for greater fame in the next war, trained his crews to work closely with infantry, though the tank's mechanical unreliability meant that few would actually reach their objectives. The Allied air arm, including American squadrons led by officers like Colonel William Mitchell, would provide over 1,400 aircraft, the largest concentration of air power yet assembled for reconnaissance, ground attack, and aerial combat missions designed to isolate the battlefield from German reinforcement. The American First Army, commanded by Pershing himself, assembled over 500,000 troops for the offensive. Organized into 3 corps comprising 16 divisions with additional divisions held in reserve, this massive concentration represented a logistical achievement rivaling the tactical operation itself. Moving troops, artillery, ammunition, fuel, food, and all the material modern armies required to designated positions, while maintaining operational security so Germans would not detect the buildup, challenged staff officers who were still learning their profession. That the operation came together at all testified to American organizational capacity, even if execution revealed numerous inefficiencies that more experienced armies would have avoided. At 1 o'clock in the morning on September 12th, over 3,000 Allied guns opened fire on German positions, beginning a 4-hour bombardment that announced American intentions with thunderous authority. The psychological impact of this massive fire concentration equaled its physical effects. German defenders cowering in dugouts understood that a major assault was imminent, and that their positions would soon be overrun by fresh troops whose numerical superiority was overwhelming. When American infantry advanced at 5 o'clock in the morning through rain and fog, they encountered surprisingly light resistance as German forces executed a previously planned withdrawal from the salient, trading space for preservation of their forces. The American advance proceeded with remarkable speed, covering distances and hours that earlier Western Front offensives had required weeks to achieve. Infantry marched forward behind creeping artillery barrages, encountering abandoned German positions, captured supply dumps, and occasional rearguard units left behind to delay pursuit. The ease of the advance created almost euphoric confidence. Soldiers who had expected brutal combat instead found themselves liberating French territory with minimal casualties. Towns that had endured for years of German occupation celebrated liberation with emotional scenes as grateful civilians embraced American soldiers and offered what food and wine they possessed. Lieutenant Harry S. Truman, commanding an artillery battery from Missouri and destined for political prominence after the war, remembered the Saint-Mihiel offensive as a revelation of what American forces could accomplish when properly organized and employed. His battery displaced forward repeatedly to maintain fire support for advancing infantry, adapting to fluid circumstances that static trench warfare never required. The experience built confidence among officers and enlisted men alike, creating belief that American arms could prevail against any opposition when given the opportunity. By September 16th, American forces had eliminated the St. Mihiel salient, advancing up to 13 miles in some sectors, capturing over 15,000 prisoners and 443 artillery pieces, and liberating 200 square miles of French territory. Total American casualties numbered approximately 7,000 killed and wounded, substantial losses by pre-war standards, but remarkably light compared to what earlier Western Front offensives had cost. The ease of the victory, however, was somewhat misleading. German forces had chosen not to defend the salient vigorously, and American troops had not faced the determined resistance that awaited them in their next operation. Just 10 days after completing the St. Mihiel operation, the American First Army began redeploying northward for what would become the largest and costliest battle in United States military history to that point. It's a Meuse-Argonne offensive, a 47-day struggle that would test American endurance, to reveal continuing deficiencies in training and leadership, and ultimately contribute to forcing Germany to seek armistice terms. The offensive, launched on September 26, 1918, aimed to drive through heavily fortified German defensive positions between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest, cutting the Sedan-Mézières railway that supplied German forces across a broad front and potentially forcing a general German collapse. The terrain selected for the offensive was among the most defensible on the entire Western Front, consisting of parallel ridges that provided natural defensive positions, dense forests that channeled attackers into killing zones, and villages transformed into fortified strongpoints bristling with machine guns and artillery. German forces had occupied this region for 4 years, constructing elaborate defenses that incorporated concrete bunkers, deep trenches, extensive wire entanglements, and all the apparatus of modern defensive warfare. The German defensive system consisted of multiple belts, the Giesler Stellung, the Kriemhild Stellung, and others, each designed to slow and bleed attacking forces even if individual positions fell. General Pershing's decision to launch the Meuse-Argonne offensive so soon after St. Mihiel created enormous logistical challenges. Staff officers struggled to move units, relocate artillery, stockpile supplies, and coordinate with Allied forces while maintaining operational security. Roads became clogged with traffic as divisions displaced forward, creating chaos that delayed movements and left units arriving at jump-off positions, with minimal time to reconnoiter ground or coordinate attacks. Inexperienced staff officers made errors that veteran armies would have avoided, while communication failures left commanders without accurate information about where their units actually were or what they were doing. The offensive began promisingly on September 26th, as American forces advanced against relatively light initial resistance, penetrating several miles into German defensive zones. But the advance quickly stalled, as troops encountered the Giesler Stellung's main defensive belt, where German machine gunners and artillery observers enjoyed excellent fields of fire against Americans struggling through broken terrain. The Argonne Forest on the western flank became a nightmare of close-quarters combat reminiscent of below, but on a larger scale, while attempts to advance up the Meuse River Valley on the eastern flank foundered against German artillery positioned on heights across the river. Corporal Alvin C. York from Tennessee achieved legendary status during the Meuse-Argonne offensive through actions on October 8th that exemplified both extraordinary individual initiative and the chaotic nature of the fighting. York's patrol of 17 men, attempting to silence German machine guns, found itself behind enemy lines facing multiple enemy positions. When the patrol leader and others were killed or wounded, York took command and, using his marksmanship skills developed hunting in Tennessee mountains, systematically killed or wounded over 20 German soldiers before forcing the surrender of 132 others. York's feat earned him the Medal of Honor and transformed him into a national hero, though he remained uncomfortable with fame and returned to Tennessee, seeking only to resume his pre-war life. The offensive ground forward through October at terrible cost, with American divisions suffering casualties that required their withdrawal and replacement by fresh units, creating a rotation system that consumed the entire First Army and eventually necessitated activating the Second Army to maintain offensive pressure. By late October, American forces had penetrated the Kriemhild Stellung and were approaching the final German defensive positions, but the advance had slowed to a crawl as exhaustion, casualties, and supply difficulties took their toll. The final weeks of the Meuse-Argonne offensive became a race between American military pressure and German political collapse. As revolutionary sentiment swept through, Germany and the imperial government desperately sought armistice terms that might preserve some semblance of organized state authority before complete disintegration occurred. American forces renewed their assault in early November, attacking exhausted German defenders who understood that their nation's defeat was inevitable, but continued fighting with professional discipline, even as their government crumbled behind them. The advance accelerated as German resistance weakened, with American troops reaching the outskirts of Sedan on November 7th, cutting the crucial railway system and severing German communications across the front. At 5 o'clock in the morning, on November 11th, 1918, representatives of the German government and the Allied Supreme Command signed armistice terms in a railway carriage in the Compiègne forest, agreeing to cease hostilities at 11 o'clock that same morning. The news spread rapidly through frontline positions, creating scenes of jubilation mixed with disbelief as soldiers who had lived with constant death suddenly realized they might actually survive. The American Expeditionary Forces had suffered over 320,000 casualties during the Meuse-Argonne offensive alone. With approximately 26,000 killed losses that exceeded all previous American wars combined in terms of battle deaths per day, total American casualties for the entire war numbered over 300,000, including over 53,000 battle deaths and 63,000 deaths from disease, primarily influenza during the devastating pandemic that swept military camps in 1918. These numbers shocked a nation that had entered the war with romantic notions of conflict and that now confronted the industrial-scale slaughter that characterized 20th-century warfare. The American experience in the Great War would retrospectively be called World War I, after humanity proved capable of generating an even more destructive sequel, revealed both the strengths and limitations of American military institutions. American soldiers had proven themselves courageous and adaptable, capable of matching European armies in determination, and increasingly capable of matching them in tactical proficiency as experience accumulated. American industry had demonstrated unprecedented capacity to produce the material of war, eventually overwhelming Central Powers through sheer productive superiority. Yet the war had also exposed deficiencies in doctrine, training, leadership, and strategic thinking that had cost lives unnecessarily, and that would require systematic reform if America was to fulfill its emerging role as a global power. For the soldiers themselves, the return to civilian life proved difficult in ways that non-combatants could not understand. They had experienced things that forever separated them from those who had remained homehead, witnessed death in forms that haunted their dreams, had killed other human beings, had survived circumstances that logic suggested should have killed them. Many struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Though 1920s medical understanding provided no such diagnosis or treatment, they formed veterans organizations like the American Legion, seeking community among those who shared their experiences, and they struggled to find meaning in suffering that peace rendered seemingly pointless. The Great War's legacy for America extended far beyond casualty statistics or battlefield victories. The conflict had announced American emergence as a military power capable of projecting force globally, transforming the nation from a regional presence into a country whose involvement was essential for European stability. The experience would influence military doctrine for decades, though debate would continue about whether lessons learned, particularly regarding the necessity of mass armies and industrial mobilization, remained relevant in changing strategic contexts. Most significantly, the war generated disillusionment that would shape American foreign policy throughout the interwar period, as the nation retreated into isolation partly from horror at what European entanglements had cost. The soldiers who had faced the first true test of war on European battlefields returned home changed men, carrying memories of trenches, bombardments, and battles that would fade with time, but never entirely disappear. They had proven American military capability under the most demanding circumstances imaginable, establishing a heritage that subsequent generations of American soldiers would inherit and build upon. Their sacrifices, their courage, their adaptation to warfare's terrible demands had demonstrated that American democracy could generate military forces equal to any in the world, though whether such forces should be employed remained a question that each generation would answer differently. Learning and relearning the lessons that the doughboys of 1918 had purchased with their blood on European soil that seemed forever distant from the nation they had fought to defend.